for this portion of the board meeting. This next piece really is this is an informational presentation for the board. This is the first time the board will have the opportunity to see this sequencing of our projects. And Tom and Brad from GMB that we've grown to love and know quite well, and I'm sure will even more so over the coming years. They will be making a presentation on the planned sequencing for those of you who have been following where we are with the bond projects now that we have been successful with the bond, to see that this very first step is the critical piece in terms of ensuring that the sequencing is such that makes sense as we move through with the projects over the next years. So they will be presenting that. We worked with them to develop this and develop some guiding principles that really drove the sequencing of the bond projects. And I'm just going to give the kind of categories of those. The board had this in their packet. These will also be posted on our website. We are keeping that very current, but mainly the first guiding principle of the sequencing process was compliance with the approved Michigan Department of Treasury application. That was critical, that everything that we do with the bond is not only monitored initially, but also throughout the process, which Tom's going to talk a little bit about that too. So it's really the integrity of the projects. And then the second guiding principle was immediate need. What are those kinds of things that we have to do immediately? The third one has to do with financial planning. What are those things that we will have in each one of the series that we have been talking about? A fourth one of our guiding principles is equity, the equity by level, high school, middle school, elementary, and then a logical sequencing of the projects. And I've mentioned that before. You can't do one until you do another, so that also went into play as a principle. And then, of course, the final one is the professional expertise and experience of our architects. We're very pleased to be working with Brad and with Tom and with GMB. They are also working with the Clarkston schools, so having that as kind of a precursor to us has been an advantage. So with that, I am going to turn this over to Tom and Brad and let you take over.
To use the mic?
Yeah. Is this still on TV?
Yes.
We're recording.
Yes, that's why we're configured.
Is that when I need to go to the board here?
Is there a roving mic? Is this? There you go.
Is that one working?
Yes, sir.
All right, so yeah, bond pass, exciting. So what's the first step? Is what's the schedule? What's the sequencing? It's a lot of work getting everything together. So we went through a couple of half-day workshops with your staff in terms of all the needs. You know, as Marion was saying, there's a lot of different lenses that get put over this stuff. It ends up being a little bit like a fantasy football draft night. You get this big board, and we had a lot of discussion of different lenses and put stuff back and forth and changed it. We went through 2 different days, and then Brad and I kind of pulled it together and ended up with this final plan that makes sense for all those different components. We will ultimately get a document that's more of an 8.5 by 11 readable document that you can put in front of you and just see sort of, hey, this project's going to happen this date kind of thing. This is not meant to be something that you can read. So if you're sitting there going, oh, I can't read that detail, it's not really, that's not what it's about. It's more the graphic that shows you the projects and what's on them and when they're going to happen and sort of that strategy. And so we'll get that document a little bit later. Just format-wise, you see the one on the right, that's everything together. That's sort of a one-sheet kind of a format. And then these are that same document in 9 different sheets, just so it's at least readable if you walk up and look at it, if you get close to it. One of the things, I guess Marion was saying, the process involves a lot of different lenses. There's a few others, too, that we looked at. You know, there's some useful life things in certain buildings when they really needed work quickly. Some of the things have to do with safety in terms of when students, the highest priority for certain safety needs. There were some curriculum program needs at certain buildings. The economies of scale when we do this with contractors as well is very important, that we don't hit the market and flood the market for certain components so that they can only bid on part of it. We want them to be attractive for 9 years. This is a 9-year plan. And so that was also very important. There is some coordination with the sinking fund as well, which makes it a little bit complex, and even your own staff workload in terms of these projects require your staff to be, it's our daytime job, but your staff all has other day jobs that have to help us with this. So it does affect it. It becomes a very complex thing. There's probably 10 or 11 different criteria. There are these guiding principles that make it a complex solution. So if you look through any one lens, you might say, well, I would maybe do it like this, but that's only one lens that applies to the schedule. So it is important to put those all together. I'll explain the chart a little bit to you. It's basically, as you move across, it's the years, basically starting here in the end of 2018, so it's 19, 20, all the way to the end. Broken up basically in the 3 series that the bond's going to be put into. So these first 3 are Series 1, the first 3 years, then Series 2 and Series 3, the 3 different years. That is important when you start looking at the financial stuff Marion was talking about. Those have to fit into certain criteria mathematically, or we get out of sync with what we can borrow in terms of your maximum number. Then vertically, each building is listed, and they're listed from basically the K on down to high school. They're listed alphabetically. It's the same order that if you look at the Treasury document that they're on the document. So that's the same order organization they're in there. In each project, as you look at some detail over time, just to explain it to you a little bit, there's a box here. So for example, Carpenter Elementary lists new construction, remodeling, site work, FF&E, which is the furniture and fixtures and equipment, and then a subtotal. That's the number that's on the bond document. The Treasury document has that number. So that's the starting point that gives you the math that's for the total. As you move across, and I'll get into each of them and explain to you what's actually happening, but each of these projects is broken up into a bar of the different projects per building. So I'm going to pick one here, for example, of Orion Oaks. And this bar, as you read across, describes a project in that building. So it will list, basically, if you read the text here, it lists the primary scope of that project. So for example, here it's the secure entry, all the remodeling, additions, the site work, and the playground work describes that bar. This is the duration of that project. There's another project with some furnishings later on for that building. And then the bars are broken into colors, and then mean a little bit. It's not super critical for you to worry about. But there's always in the beginning a chance for tours if there are projects that need some investigation about what are other people doing, what's kind of the latest trends. There's some tours that overlay on some field verification of the building, things my team's doing to look at the existing structure, and programming for what we want to do. The green bar is basically the design time in a project. That's the time when we're working with your staff to develop, your design team to develop that project. What is that project going to be, and what does it look like? So the programming and schematic design is where the first things come together. What is the program going to be? What are we going to build? What does it maybe look like real roughly? That's where a lot of the decisions happen that let us flush out, hey, what about option A, option B, option C? Did we think about that? So that happens right in here. As we move past that, it's into a construction phase where it's really just technical stuff with this construction manager and us and a few people on your staff. But that's a time when anything and everything is talked about and thought about for that project. As you can see, some projects may be a while before that happens. So that's getting identified here in terms of the year that applies, but the actual decisions as to what some of those details are, you'll see some of those options in that, whatever year that applies to. So across the green then is basically the design time. At the end of that period, there's a bidding time. That's the red that's shown. The red includes bidding and contracts, interviews with the contractors, make sure they understand the drawings, et cetera, and then awarding contracts to them. There's a time where they have to secure materials and get their stuff ready, so they're prepared for typically a construction time in the summer. That's most of the projects for a school have to happen in the summer, so school can go on. There are some big projects that are new, that they obviously take more than a summer, but most of the renovations on your existing buildings have to work around a summer. So that's where, in every instance, when you see the year, you'll see the dark gray pieces. those indicate the summer times that are really the opportune time for construction, both for the contractors and for you to stay in business because you have kids that have to be in the buildings. So then when you get to the, on that piece of the red is the contractor component, underneath that is the gray state review, a heavy time that the state audits and reviews everything we're doing. They typically will not do that until the project is done, designed, they want to see the documents. So there's a time there too that we can't really start construction until that's gone through the review process. A lot of agencies are looking at every project and validating that codes are met and that the bond is met, the treasury document intent is all met. So there's a lot of audit that goes on in that time period. Then the orange bar is the construction piece. A little bit longer in certain projects, and we'll get into that a little bit specifically on some of the projects as we go. Then there's an occupancy and a punch list time that goes on for a project. That's basically an example of all the design components. There are a little bit different lengths on some of them, but they occur to some degree on that component for every project. So that describes you what's there. In each one of those, if you're looking at detail, with each project, there's also a very similar listing here in terms of the new construction, remodel, site work, FF&E. Those are treasury categories that are required to be tracked. Those are the values that are associated with this project. So for example, at Orion Oaks, this total here is broken up into this project and a component over here in this project. That equals the total for the whole building in the 9 years. So, obviously, if there are questions on that, you can ask me later, or if we want to go along the way, you can ask some questions too, but they're very similar in terms of how they're laid out. I'll go through now, basically tell you the way the organization they have right now, and again, it's just going to start, I'll go through each building in its completeness. It's a little bit easier to understand, I think, than going through each year, but we can backtrack on some of that if you want to look at the pieces in each year. But so the new Early Childhood Center is at the top. Again, it starts with the pre-K in terms of the treasury document. That is a piece that we are trying to get ready for these, get design teams ready, so that beginning of the year, we're going to start meeting with design teams and developing these projects. So that's one of them that will start right at the beginning of the year and start in the design phase, getting to the point where we bid in November, December. That's the target we like to shoot for, especially all these big projects. It's very important for what we're finding for just pricing comes in a lot better if we get too late in the bidding climate late into the spring. It changes your value of your pricing. We're finding that not to be favorable for the cost of a project. So those are all targeted, if you look at that, to basically be ready to bid somewhere at the end of November to the end of December, November, December. So that again is a design time of, over the summer for 2019.
I have that one on mute.
Is that good?
Yes.
So, and I'll go a little bit quicker on these as we get going here, but that's basically how that works. We have the design time that we'll be starting here in January, February, being prepared to get documents out for bid in the end of the year, then getting the beginning of the year, that whole state review process and contractor work, so that site work and new construction can start. That will put us in about a 1.5 year process for construction for that building for 2021 occupancy. In that same timeline, there are other things that will happen in that project. One of them will be piloting furnishings for the pre-K and kindergarten classrooms. The kindergarten rooms that are in the other buildings will be joining us for that piece. We'll be piloting at once for any of the projects that receive furnishings. So that pilot process will go on, be piloting at the beginning of 2020 so that we know which furniture we want to order, design process for that so that the furniture is available at the same time the building opens. So that's kind of how some of those sequences work for that.
Tom, I have a question. So
Yep.
at that time also at Orion Oaks, is that when they're going to do like the roundabout, or there was discussion of changing how the parking structure was going to be? So will that be included at that time with the Early Childhood Center, or is that?
Yes, and that's partially why these two are together.
Okay.
Because there's so much synthesis of that site, so that that design can go on concurrently to make sure that we're not like, oh, we would have done it a little differently. So that is a component of why those two ended up in the same time, same schedule. So, is that what you're after?
That answers the
Yep.
question. My question is though, it looked like on this, in the board packet, it started with NODA. I don't know, are you going to talk about that later, or is that, okay, that's your next thing.
This
Okay.
NOTA one here?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
sure. And that,
Oh, I'm sorry. We didn't.
Wait a minute.
Because some of your
Tom gets through
questions
some of the.
may be answered as Tom goes through the
Okay.
demo.
One thing I forgot to mention was some of the colors that are related to these, the titles of each building. Most of them are this sort of salmon pinkish color. That's just a standard project. We have highlighted the ones with purple that tell us a project that we think is a little more conducive to have community members on the design teams. So more input, it's going to be more of a high visibility thing. When we're doing a parking lot of transportation, we do not have them involved in that. So it's more nuts and bolts. So those are the ones that are highlighted that we want community involved in these design teams to help understand and give input as to what's going on. So that is one other color piece. I did miss also the little blue dots here. So what do the blue dots mean? Each one of those phases, just construction standards, industry standards. There's a programming phase, what are we going to build? Schematic design, the first rough layout of that. And then it turns into design development, sort of a 3D implication of that, more detail. And then the final construction documents are the bid set of documents. At the end of each one of those phases, we want to make sure we go through a budgeting process and say, are we on track? We want to build 10 classrooms, we only had budgeted 5, how are we going to do that? And so each one of those has to have a budgeting process. This construction manager will help with estimating, so we understand before we move on how we're going to navigate that. You have, I forget the name of it, but your planning team. Yeah, your project management team will be helping, at each one of those phases to balance the budget. What are we going to do? Everybody would like to do a little more than we can. That's very normal. How do we get back on track? And then a couple times in there, there'd be the board, sort of a building committee, kind of a review of some of these things, so you have an understanding of where we're headed before it's just an entire bid. Here's the bids, are they okay? That's sort of that design process. Once we get into here, there's not much of your staff that'll be involved. It's construction at that point and those kind of details. All right, so back to the schedule up here. The Blanche Sims is the one that has NOTA on it. And so the first component of that, this is a very complicated sequencing one, is giving NOTA time to sort out where they're going to go. And there's some, I don't know, John, there are some things that are in the process, right, in terms of that, but that's going to take a little bit of time as to where does NOTA go. And as soon as that's complete and they're relocated, then we can move into the demolition component. And so at this schedule, we're giving ourselves about 9 months to a year to pull that off, and then the demolition component of the old piece can start. That has to happen before we can build the new, because it's going to be in that area it's going to overlap the area of the existing NOTA facility, your old transportation building. Then once that's done, we'll move into the construction phase of the new building. It basically sets right there. That will be able to be constructed and designed in a way that we're planning that you'll stay in the existing building. The new construction will just be right next to it.
So Tom, can I interrupt you?
Yeah.
The NOTA world, and they're currently leasing some space at the facility. So the 9 months to a year in terms of the positive outcome for NOTA's relocation, one of the possibilities is, I've got to use the microphone. One of the outcomes is the relocation of them to our existing transportation facility, grounds and fleet over there too.
Yeah.
That's being looked at and in the process of being evaluated
Right.
by them and us.
So there's a lot of dominoes in that one that are going to take some time, and agencies are involved. We also have to do some site preparation that's going to have some agencies involved, and so that'll take some time in here to resolve all that, so that when we are ready, that's all taken care of and construction can start. You will be living in the building next door to construction. Always a little bit of headache with that, but it'll be, hopefully you have fun with it and kids can watch that happen. But then the idea is that by the end of that summer, you will basically leave in the beginning of the summer and then come back to a new building in the fall. That demolition will happen over the summertime. It may extend a little bit past the summer in terms of how much time the CM will need, and we'll need them on board. Again, these are milestone kind of things. We're going to get exact dates to the week and day kind of thing with a CM each year as we pull these together a little bit. But these give us milestones as to the timing that it has to happen per year. And then the furnishings, again, designed and ready to show up the beginning of that building when it opens. So they will be a little bit lagged, as you'll see from the other elementaries, but we don't want to put new furnishings in an old building and then take them out and damage them, and so there's some of that logic as well. But then they will be done. The rest of the bond will be done for Blanche Sims. I guess stop me along the way if you want to. I'll just, for sake of time, I'll keep prodding along here. Carpenter's the next one, and that one is as well. going to be starting right away in the beginning of the year, the design phase, and then bidding same time with the Early Childhood Center, et cetera. It will be done quicker because it's only going to be over the time of a summer. It will require some time past the summer, either the front or the end. We'll have to sort that out with the construction manager, because some of those additions that happen there are some support spaces and stuff might take a little more than the 3 months. So that's why the bar is a little longer than just the time. But all the renovation where the kids are happen in the summer alone. That piece has furnishings as well. We're going to be piloting first and second grade pilots, and then third through fifth grade pilots for furnishings. That'll start in terms of some ideas and design right away. The idea is that by Christmas, basically next year, we'll have pilots that we can purchase, and then they will try them out for 4 or 5 months, and then tell us what they think of them, and then that informs what the district wants to do before we purchase, so that they're ready for when the building opens. That will be done for all the elementaries. I'm only showing it one time. The pilot will go through a process that includes people from all the stakeholders that will be interested, all the elementaries. But where they go yet, we don't have that sorted out, but it'll happen as one pilot process. It will be simultaneous with the pre-K and K, because they need theirs for the new building as well. So Carpenter, again, it will be done this summer in terms of the construction. They will get their furnishings the next summer. That parallels the other elementaries as well. So Orion Oaks will also be done this summer. That has to do with the idea of the Early Childhood Center and going through all the options together. So we're studying all that together, because that's going to be a complex site. And again, we'll be looking at all kinds of options there. You know, the bond graphic is a starting point, and we'll go through all kinds of options, what makes sense, and narrow that down. But that'll be, you know, by the summer, we'll have that figured out, and we'll be documenting what our solution is going to be. Again, bidding at the end of the year, construction over the summer, the following summer. That will, that will be a little bit longer as well, because there is an addition, special education addition to that building that will take more than 3 months. And then they follow the same furnishings component. That following year, they will get the furnishings for the classrooms. Paint Creek is a little bit later. Some of this, again, has to do with some of the financing and, you know, the newer building, et cetera. So that does start in the spring, early year of 20. Design time, again, bidding in that fall, winter, and then construction in 21. That is, oh, I'm sorry, that is only the secure entry and the furnishings. I should have read my own notes here. We wanted to get the secure entries, basically, for all the elementaries in the first 3 years, so that they're not waiting, even though their needs really aren't for later. Didn't want to have security be like, well, you're going to wait 8 years before you get your security. So that's why that's broken apart, to deal with the security component for Paint Creek, and then the furnishings parallels the other elementaries when they get theirs. The work that happens at Paint Creek is down a little ways. 2024 is the design time, and that's the remaining renovations and the site work that happens for them. Stadium Drive will wait a year, but it starts in the 2020 time. It has something to do with trying to also, similar to the Orion Oaks thing, doing some master planning of that whole site, because they're not just a standalone. That's that whole Scripps campus kind of thing that we need to evaluate, and that's going to take some time, and it wants to be closer to some of these other projects. So their design time, basically the construction in 21, and then their site work pushed off to here. This is getting them their secure entry and their furnishings, and the site work's pushed off to better align with the middle school stuff, so we can do that site component. Then Weber is moved forward. We've got a lot of security issues there, the site, the traffic, there's some crazy stuff going there. So that will be, again, starting in the beginning of this coming year. Design time for construction over the following summer, and that will be a 2-summer project, because there's going to be an addition that replaces classrooms, but we're going to have to keep the classrooms while we're building that addition, so they'll be in those classrooms. The following summer, we can tear them down and then finish the renovations and the tie-ins to there. So that will be a time where it's set somewhat stagnant for a little while construction-wise, so that there's time to educate the kids without construction on top of them. But that will be done in one bid, in one phase, constructed over 2 summers, and then they will be complete. There are, in the middle school components, there are some band instruments. That's what these show. The intent is next year to both the high school and the middle schools, have some purchasing of band instruments. Those just are shown to occur nominally in next year. The middle schools themselves, Oakview starts 2020, the design for the furnishings piece, and that will be a pilot. The same thing, all three middle schools will be piloting together, similar to the process of the elementary schools, piloting the design of that, the determination of what they want the pilots to be. They'll be piloting the January of 2021 for 5 months again, so they can then design their furnishings to come in this year here. Again, all three middle schools having that together. So Oakview itself will purchase the furnishings, design it for this year, and then start the secure entries in '22. That's where we're going to do all the middle schools, that timeline for the secure entries, design, and then construction in '23. Then the remainder of the site work happening the following year for Oakview. Scripps Middle School, secure entry, all the remodeling, site work happening here. That one is the whole timing thing of that whole campus. So that design will happen here for the construction here. That will happen one time and they'll be done. All their work is at one project phase, so they're a little bit lucky that way. Walden Middle School, similar classroom furnishings once the pilot is done. And then their secure entry right away with the middle school, so they get it at the same time as the other two. And then the following year, all the remaining remodel and site work will happen. High school, again, the band instruments purchased right away. Then we're looking at piloting the furnishings for them as well, roughly in this year, 2020. Then the classroom furnishings purchased potentially that next year of 2022. And then the classroom, follow my lines here. The remodeling happening, and obviously there's a big chunk of the funds in terms of balancing the series that happens with the high school. So it's in 2024 that the design work happens, the majority of the remodel and the site work that goes on to that building for construction in 25. So again, that's an example of one where it'll be a while till we get to talk about what that all means at the high school. It's not going to happen in the next couple years. Let's see. Then the CERC building, there's some movement things that go on with some of the storage that goes on in your building. But it, again, is over here. It has to happen after the high school is done because there are some things that we're replacing, that we're going to replace with the CERC when we tear it down, that we have to have the high school built before we do that. So that's sort of a sequencing component there. Again, 2025, that design for 26, the construction and demolition of the portion of that building. District administration and Moose Tree both have some very small components for some lighting upgrades and some very small renovations, some finishes, et cetera, that are scheduled for the very end of the project. It lets us really see where everything is at in terms of how the project develop as well. So those are year 9, basically, that would happen. Pine Tree is scheduled for, we just did some renovations this summer, so we've got the immediate needs taken care of. So it is scheduled for 22 to go into the design, and then the site work renovations in 23. And then transportation. This year we'll be looking at purchasing some buses and some lift equipment, and then the remodeling is primarily some very minor remodeling and then some pavement replacement in 23. And then district-wide things, there is some equipment going to be purchased in 19, and the BMS building controls, looking at starting that next year as well. That's a big operational savings in terms of how the mechanical systems are run, so they want to look at starting that basically this in 19. The technology component, Jeff, you want to speak to it or not, but basically it's going to happen every year, regularly, so we don't have it barred on there, but every year there'll be a component of the technology. That's good enough. So that's every line. I'm going a little bit fast there, I apologize for that, but lots of stuff, and we had to move the stuff back and forth a little bit because this didn't make sense for certain sequencing, but it lays out very well. Meets our treasury piece.
I think it's important to remember that when we began this process, we looked at a long-term master plan for the district. And that's always been, the main goal is to have a long-term plan for the district. And part of that long-term planning is doing things gradually over time. And this multi-series bond issue fits perfectly into that scenario because it allows you to hit the highest priority things first, and then over the next 9 years, continually improve areas of the district and to keep moving positively in the right direction. So it fits with what we began immediately as we started working this process. The difficulty is that nobody likes to be the last project, right? However, it's been prioritized that way really from the beginning, is that we're hitting the highest needs first and then gradually working out into the rest of the district. And the sequencing really has come together very well. We've done this many, many times for a lot of districts. This one, because of the number of buildings you have, the number of years that you have, the intensity of what we're touching some of your buildings is very complicated, but I think it's very manageable and very doable as we look at moving this forward for the next several years.
Yeah, that's really it for the presentation wise. If there's any questions you want to.
No, I just want to remind the board.
Microphone.
Hold on, coming up there. I just want to call to your attention this graphic that we've used so that everyone has an understanding really of that whole idea of decision-making and advisory, and you did touch on that, that leadership and so forth, but that project management team that Tom mentioned kind of is the middle of this, that will be steering this whole thing, and then taking it to the Board of Ed board subcommittee, and then to the full board. So I don't know if just want to remind you about this, so we don't forget what our structure is. And thank you very much.
We do have copies, I think, that we're going to give to the board.
This is your homework.
You may need a magnifying glass to read those, because if you think it's small print on here, it's really small on there, but it's a reference point.
Yeah, and I guess I would remind you that those are meant to be graphics. They're not really, you're digging into the details. They're really meant to be a graphic so you can kind of see how things flow and the basics of, when this building is happening. So
And we're going to continually update you as a board as we go through this process. This is the first time we're unveiling this, but on a regular basis, we will be updating the progress and showing you exactly where we are in the process as we move this forward. So that communication that we began early will continue for the next several years.
So does everybody understand conceptually where the different series breaks occur?
Give them the mic.
So from a graphic
John,
point
wait.
of view. So from a graphic point of view, when it comes to the series, and we'd authorized, the board authorized earlier tonight, the bond issuance authorizing resolution, these three columns basically represent what's going on in Series 1, Series 2, and the back end of Series 3. So the project sequencing, the byproduct, one of the byproducts is the bonding structure and the finance, the cash flow management of the whole process.
Do you want to talk about where we're at right now in terms of the legalities and the signing and
In terms of where we're at, in terms of issues, the timeframe for the
signing and January and February?
Yep, the funding for these three columns, it's landed about 73 million. I can't remember if it was a rounded number we used for the formal bonding structure, but in terms of timelines, we're in the process of putting together formal marketing documents for the bonds itself. January 22nd will be what's referred to as the pricing date. So in terms of the $73 million of Series 1, that's when it's actually sold. And then in the end of February 27th, is the formal closing date, much like closing on a house. There's a bunch of paperwork and everything that goes on in that process. As of the 27th of February, that's when we'll receive the bond proceeds. So at that point, everything's a go. So far, the market looks good, everything's falling out fairly well, and it's time to get running.
Okay,